The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Last week we spoke with Dr. Erin Mee of New York University about the history of Sanskrit theater in India. This week we're continuing our discussion with a consideration of how modern Indian theater has developed in the course of colonialism and independence. Erin, hello again.
Hello.
Where, when, and how did modern theater develop in India?
Modern theater in India developed as part of the colonial enterprise in 3 port cities that were established and built up by the British East India Company in Calcutta, Bombay, and to a lesser extent Madras. These cities are now known as Kolkata, Mumbai, and Chennai. I'll probably refer to them by their 19th century names just for historic consistency. But in the 19th century, the British introduced modern European theater to these colonial cities in 3 ways. By touring productions to entertain their expat communities, which is to say the merchants who were there. By supporting productions of English plays staged by the expats themselves in newly erected British-style playhouses. And by teaching English drama in Indian universities, where Shakespeare was actually presented as the apex of British civilization. So the spread of English drama was part of colonizing Indian culture. It was designed not only to shape artistic activity, but to impose on Indians a way of understanding and operating in the world, and to assert colonial cultural superiority. So one of the things that happened in places like Bombay and Calcutta is that theaters were built to accommodate these touring productions of English plays. And what's interesting about these theaters, including, for example, the Grant Road Theater in Bombay, is that they were designed to remind their audiences of home. They were exact copies of their English counterparts, with a pit, gallery, dress boxes, painted perspective scenery, wings, footlights, a front curtain, chandeliers, so that when they were inside, these audiences were in a British space. And in fact, actually, there was one theater goer who wrote a little poem that was published in a newspaper in the 1800s in Bombay. He said that the amateur theater recreated the semblance of the land his childhood knew, wherein he could be, however temporarily, transported home. So he wrote, and as the shifting scenes perchance recall the peaceful cottage or the squire's hall, he, all forgetting India's burning clime, fancies again he hears his village chime. So it was a place where British expats, merchants, and the soldiers who were then sent to protect them could go to feel as though they were literally and figuratively at home. And as English merchants began to work with Indian merchants began to attend the theater. And in fact, there's a British Indian Gentleman's Gazette was the name of a newspaper in Bombay. And one of their writers pointed out that the woman who ran the theater was likely to bring about the kinds of transformation that missionaries and soldiers could not. So English language drama was consciously being used to disseminate the values of the British Empire. And it began to be then taught in the universities that were established in Calcutta and Bombay. So there was a colonial educational policy set up by Thomas Macaulay, who believed in the superiority of English culture and wanted to create, and I quote here, a class of persons Indian in blood and culture, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. And his educational policy was designed to inculcate a set of values into the students who would then learn to think of English culture as superior. Macaulay's educational policy was formalized in the Education Act of 1835, which was followed by an 1844 resolution that gave preference to Indians who had distinguished themselves in European literature. So it became important for people in Bombay and Calcutta to receive this education because this is how they got jobs, right? And then what happened was that these people who studied literature in these universities, places like Elphinstone College, etc., began to study Shakespeare and began to write plays based on the dramaturgical structures of Shakespeare, etc., and later Ibsen. So what happened was you got a number of plays like Kutiyattam, which in fact is a very interesting play because although it appears on the surface to use this colonial dramaturgical structure and appears then to be part of disseminating colonial values, there's a scholar who's argued, I think quite persuasively, that the dramaturgical structure cloaked a very anti-colonial message. But what happened then was that instead of plays that would take 41 nights, such as Kutiyattam, or be performed all night, such as Kathakali or Jatra or Nautanki or Tamasha, or any of the genres of performance that were popular at the time. What happened then with the building of theaters is ticket sales, etc. So instead of having, for example, 41-night Kutiyattam performance sponsored by a temple, or an all-night Kathakali performance sponsored by the local king, or a popular entertainment such as Tamasha or Nautanki, you had plays being performed in private spaces and with ticket sales. So theater began to be commercialized. Instead of performances occurring on a harvest calendar or a ritual calendar, performances were scheduled for Friday and Saturday night. So you had a situation where people would buy a ticket and go on Friday night to see a performance. And what happened then was that in order to sell those tickets, people began to have to guarantee their quality. When a performance is free, when it's sponsored by the temple or the local king or the local someone else, you can take a risk on it. When you have to pay money and, get your carriage and go on a Friday night, you begin to wonder if it's any good. And so people began to advertise these plays as saying, well, the performers are not going to improvise, they'll stick to the text. Which meant that if you knew that the text was good and you could vet the text, that you could guarantee a certain level of performance. This led to a kind of play that was more text-based, right? More text-driven, more playwright-initiated. So whereas Kutiyattam is based on play texts, by the time an 8-page play takes 41 nights to perform, the play itself, that written text, is not the most important part of the performance. What happens in Bombay and Calcutta is that the text becomes the most important part of the performance. And the productions begin to be very text-based and plot-driven. This is then in contradistinction to the quote-unquote indigenous genres of performance, such as Kathakali, Nautanki, Kutiyattam, Jatra, etc. So what happened then is that the people who were being educated in these English universities, such as Elphinstone College, were being taught to valorize plays such as Shakespeare and the Indian plays that seemed most like Shakespeare. And they were being taught that these other plays that took all night were not great theater, not as good as the colonial drama that they were seeing. And so the performance genres that were actor-driven or based on elaboration began to be marginalized. And I'm oversimplifying here in order to create a kind of understandable narrative in the context of a 45-minute podcast. It's obviously much more complicated than that. But this, I would say, is one way of telling the story and understanding how modern theater arrives. There was then in Bombay a push and pull between these quote-unquote text-driven plays and plays with music and dance, which began to be known as Sanskrit nataks. They were incredibly popular and written in a number of different languages. Very exciting. They then died out, actually, when film began to be popular, because the kinds of stories and dramaturgical structures and modes of performance were easily adopted and adapted by cinema, which was then cheaper and more spectacular to produce, and so the Sangeet Nataks really died out. What happened then was that Ibsen was introduced to India, and so in 1931 we get a piece called The Golden Spire, which is a Marathi play that has a unity of time and place, a single narrative line. It is realistic human beings, so no longer gods and goddesses, right? We're talking about secular theater as opposed to theater that can be or is also a religious ritual. And so the characters in these plays begin to be human. They begin to speak in prose the way we speak in everyday life as opposed to speaking in verse. They begin to inhabit realistic places, etc., etc. And then there's a play that was produced in 1933, School for the Blind, which is considered the first modern play in Marathi. And it was actually produced by a theater company that was formed with the very specific purpose of bringing modern drama to the Marathi stage. And the way this company defined modern Marathi theater was psychologically developed characters, a plausible plot, conversational dialogue, realistic behavior, a stage set that represented a real time and a place, and a 3-act structure. The other thing that this play had was women playing women's roles, as opposed to many genres of classical Indian theater in which men play women's roles. So by 1933, modern theater in Bombay had been conflated with naturalism, and the two had become synonymous. And there's a similar sort of history and trajectory in Calcutta. So theaters that didn't conform to this emerging definition of theater were not actually considered theater. They were marginalized, and they began to be called performance, or they began to be called folk theater or something else, right? So that then when people wrote history books called Indian theater, they would include Sanskrit drama, the plays of Bhasa and Kalidasa, and then they would skip forward to the 1930s. So modern theater began to look like a gift from the British. So I would argue that the term theater is actually quite political. I would argue that dramaturgical structure is political, and that modes of engagement are political. And that what happened was that modern theater in India, which developed as part of the colonial project, really embodied early on a colonial ideology and aesthetic.
So it sounds like even the term theater has this whole host of connotations, these associations with colonialism. What happens to theater or performance in India after independence?
Well, let me go back to just before independence, if I may. There was an organization called the Indian People's Theatre Association, which is commonly known as IPTA. It was formed in 1942, and what IPTA began to do was use traditional performance to spread the word about political and social issues to non-literate people. And their mission was to build on the fact that people have begun to create a new theater of their own by taking genres such as Kathakali and in fact even kutiyattam, jatra, etc., and introducing contemporary political plays and ideologies with those genres. When we spoke about Sanskrit drama and kutiyattam, I was saying that one of the jobs of the Vidushika is to make the Sanskrit drama relevant and to make political and social analogies. So in Kerala, for example, people began to take kutiyattam and use those Sanskrit plays to make contemporary political statements about colonialism and about the British. And so IPTA did that in a number of areas around the country, using local languages, using local performance genres. It's worth saying parenthetically here that India has a number of different states, each with its own history, language, culture, performing arts tradition, et cetera, et cetera. The number of officially recognized Indian languages changes from time to time. I think at the moment it's 26. And by that I mean actual languages with different scripts, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to talk about dialects, I think the number of officially recognized dialects is over 8,400. And so again, that doesn't include the number of dialects that are not officially recognized. So if you want to speak to people in any particular state or region of India, you need to really work in the local language. So IPTA had branches in Calcutta, in Bombay, et cetera, et cetera. Their most famous production is probably Nabana, New Harvest, which was written by Bhattacharya and directed by Shambhu Mitra. And the play focuses on the Bengal famine of 1943. What Nabana did really was expose the reality that the famine was not a natural disaster, but a man-made calamity, and actually, in fact, generated by the economic structure of colonialism. So Nabana was very useful in getting a particular message across to audiences. After independence, because theater had been used to disseminate colonial culture and demonstrate cultural superiority, it became a very powerful tool with which to challenge that very same colonial authority, both before and after India's independence in 1947. So after independence, a number of playwrights and directors turned to classical dance, religious ritual, martial arts, and popular entertainment, genres that had come to be identified as Indian, along with Sanskrit aesthetic theory, to see what dramaturgical structures, acting styles, and staging techniques could be used to create a quote-unquote indigenous, non-realistic style of production, which could in turn be used to identify a quote-unquote Indian theater, in contradistinction to the realism of colonial theater. And this impulse, which I think came out of IPTA, was known as the Theater of Roots movement, a post-independence effort to decolonize the aesthetics of modern Indian theater by challenging the visual practices, performer-spectator relationships, dramaturgical structures, and aesthetic goals of colonial performance. So the Theater of Roots movement sought new ways of structuring experience, new ways of perceiving the world, and new modes of social interaction that were not dictated or modeled by the values and aesthetics of colonial theater, right? And it is important to note that the Theater of Roots movement, these are not the first playwrights and directors to challenge or resist colonial culture in either their subject matter or their aesthetics. But the Roots movement challenged colonial culture and the hegemony of colonial culture by reclaiming the aesthetics of performance and by addressing the politics of aesthetics. So, for example, Kavalam Narayana Panikkar incorporates the dramaturgical structure of kutiyattam, which we discussed in the last podcast, the aesthetic goals of kutiyattam, in that he wants his productions to be rasic rather than cathartic. He uses the actor training methods of kutiyattam and kathakali, the physical training of kalaripayattu, which is a particular form of martial art in Kerala, and the actor-character relationships that are found in kutiyattam, which is a ritual performance. So Panikkar, in creating his modern Indian theater, attempts to decolonize modern Indian theater by, quote-unquote, returning to his, quote-unquote, roots, right? In Kutiyattam, Kathakali, Teyattam, Kalaripayattu, Mohiniyattam, etc., in order to create a modern Indian theater that he feels reflects the culture that he grew up in. Panikkar is a playwright and a director. He has written a number of plays, and he's also directed a number of Bhasa's plays. Panikkar has staged a production of Urubangam, of Basa's anti-war play, which is centered around the Kaurava leader Duryodhana, who dies on the battlefield because of a blow to the thigh. And this play, again, is, in its English translation, 8 pages long. And if I were to do it in New York, it would be part of a 10-minute play festival. If I were to do a kutiyattam performance, it would be 41 nights. What Panikkar does is to stage a 90-minute version of this. So he takes the dramaturgical structure of kutiyattam and adapts it for modern theater. Instead of staging the prologue, he actually cuts all but 4 lines of the prologue, and then he spends 20 minutes bringing the warriors out, and they dance a martial art dance. I would call it a dance. It's a sort of martial art sequence in which they demonstrate their machismo, their heroism, their desire to become famous warriors, etc. And Panikkar shows us how empty that is. He then brings the parents and son of Duryodhana onto the battlefield, and they have 2 lines of text: "My son, where are you? Where are you, my child?" And they repeat those 2 lines of text as they enter and as they find their son on the battlefield. And so what this does is gives you a chance to drop into and delve into their sadness and their pain on the death of their son, the sadness and pain of Duryodhana's son, the sort of brutality and horror of war. I would say that one of the main things that Panikkar adapts or takes from kutiyattam is the notion of elaboration. But in his productions, the actors are not improvising in the way that they are in kutiyattam. So they are rehearsing these elaborations and setting them in rehearsal. But what he ends up with then is a modern production of a Sanskrit play that is informed and inspired by kutiyattam, but is very much a modern production for a contemporary audience. One of the playwrights who's associated with the Theatre of Roots movement and very well known is Girish Karnad, and his play Hayavadana is one of the poster plays of the movement because he combines some of the dramaturgical structure of Yakshagana, which is a classical dance drama of Karnataka, which is where he's from, with a sort of modern theatrical dramaturgical structure that we are familiar with from playwrights like Ibsen. He centers his play around the character Padmini, who marries Devadatta but falls in love with Devadatta's best friend. And so I won't go into too much detail, but they go off to a Kali temple. The men end up cutting off their heads, and she ends up putting their heads back on, but the wrong way. So she puts Devadatta's head on Kapila's body and Kapila's head on Devadatta's body, leading to the central question of the play: which man is her husband, the one with Devadatta's head or the one with his body? And it's a very interesting and fun play. It's just a beautiful, beautiful play. But Karnad really, the central story of Padmini is linear, but then he surrounds that central story with some concentric circles. So there's a horse-headed man who's trying to become a complete being. The play opens with Ganesh, who is a deity with a man's body and an elephant's head. Again, a story I won't go into, but another way of looking at this question: who are we? Are we our bodies or are we our head? And I would say that if you want to know more about Hayavadana, you can look at chapter 3 of my book, Theatre of Roots, just to save a little time in this podcast. But it's an amazing, wonderful play. And it really does create a play that I would say is more than the sum of its parts. It's a hybrid play that is both Western and Indian, but more than either one of those things. And quite incredible. The other person whose work I think is wonderful and worth investigating is Ratan PM, who's a playwright and director. His work has been seen in the United States all around and at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. And I won't go into his work in great detail, but just to say that Chakravyuha is an amazing play and available in English translation and well worth checking into.
What about playwrights who are working in maybe a more conventional or realistic mode, something that Western audiences might more immediately recognize?
Well, there's the work of Vijay Tendulkar, who's written a number of really fantastic plays, and Mahesh L. Kunchwar is well known for realistic theater. In fact, he said, look, I grew up in, a major metropolis. Western theater is what I know. It is mine. I am writing in that tradition. I don't have roots to go back to. So Ibsen is my roots. There is also a wonderful writer, Mahesh Dattani, who writes in English. Now, for a long time, English language theater was sidelined because it was the language of colonialism. But the reality is it's spoken by a huge number of people in India. And so Dattani writes in English for an urban audience. His plays are set on proscenium stages, and they really are focused on the nuclear family. Dattani actually started out as an actor working in English language theater, and he wanted to do Indian plays, but he didn't like the available translations, so he started writing his own plays, beginning with Where There's a Will, in which he takes as his subject the complicated dynamics of the modern urban family. His characters struggle for some kind of freedom and happiness under the oppressive weight of tradition, cultural constructions of gender, and repressed desire. Homosexuality is one taboo subject that Dattani takes out of the closet and places on stage for public viewing and dialogue. And there was a very interesting response to one of his productions. Somebody came up to him and said, I have nothing against homosexuals, but do we have to watch them on stage? And Dattani's response is, well, I have yet to meet a homosexual who says, I have nothing against heterosexuals, but do we have to watch them on stage, right? So Dattani is the first playwright to take homosexual characters, place them on stage, and treat them as three-dimensional human beings rather than as the butt of some cheap, homophobic joke. So his play, Bravely Fought the Queen, which was first performed in 1991, centers around two sisters, one of whom is tricked into marrying the man who's having an affair with her brother in order to provide a cover for their forbidden relationship. And so she escapes by drinking very heavily. And so this play really deals with the ways in which homophobia destroys lives, all kinds of lives, right? Seven Steps Around the Fire focuses on the murder of Kamala, who's a hijra. Hijras are traditional, it's an umbrella term for transgendered third sex individuals. And it turns out that Kamala was secretly married to the son of a wealthy government minister who then has Kamala killed and quickly arranges a suitable marriage for his son, etc., etc. So it again deals with people's shame because of cultural constructions of gender, etc. He's got another brilliant play, On a Muggy Night in Mumbai, and a play 30 Days in September, which addresses incest. And On a Muggy Night in Mumbai, I think, is the first Indian play to deal openly with issues of homosexuality and really to deal sympathetically with questions of love, partnership, trust, and betrayal between members of the gay community. And it shows what happens when members of the gay community are forced into the closet by a hypocritical society. I think his plays are really wonderful. They're actually available. He's filmed two of them, and they're available on Netflix. And one of them, Michael, I sent you a link, is actually available on the Asia Society's website. So 3 of his plays are available to be seen.
I understand there's also a number of really interesting women who are writing, directing, working in Indian theater.
Yes, a huge number. I would say that, in fact, at the moment, women are really moving the theater forward. Because they are asking, Kirti Jain is a very interesting director who said, what would theater be like if women had been working in theater for millennia? Because she said we've sort of inherited these male models, dramaturgical structures, modes of working, etc., etc. What would it be like if women had created these dramaturgical structures? And so you've got people like B. Jayashree, Neela Mansingh Chaudhary, Tripurari Sharma, Usha Ganguly, Veena Panichola, Gauri Ramnalayan, Tripurari Sharma, Mangai, Amala Lana, Anuradha Kapoor, Maya Rao, Catherine Sangama, numerous numerous women all over the country who are writing really interesting plays with new and exciting structures and modes of engagement. And they're really taking on all kinds of topics, the gender, the role of women. I would say that they're experimenting with form and structure and content in a very interesting way and really moving theater forward. Malala directed a piece called The Actress Binodini, Nati Binodini, and the character Binodini is played by 5 actors because Amal says she doesn't feel like just one person. So she's interested in having each character played by a number of different actors who each play aspects of that character. She is questioning the traditional notion of character, of personhood. She's saying that personhood and character is more complicated, more diverse, that we might each be 5 or 10 people rather than one person. Many of these women are creating new dramaturgical structures. Anuradha Kapoor in 2002 began working on a piece that she calls the Antigone Project, which is a video theater collaboration that came out of the Hindu-Muslim riots in Gujarat. And so she used some text from Brecht's Antigone and interspersed it with documentary footage of the riots and then testimony of the victims. And so, again, what she's doing is questioning media portrayal of the riots, questioning a notion of a sense of self, questioning who is Indian, who can... The work of Malala, Maya Rao, Anuradha Kapoor, all of these women are examining identity in a much more complicated way, I think, than the theater roots movement did. I think if you want to say that the theater roots movement was asking, who are we as Indians? What is India in the wake of independence? I think Maya, Anu, and Amal are now asking, what is a person? Who are we as people? Who are we as a country? Are we a Hindu country, a Muslim country, both? Is there room for everybody? Maya Rao, in wake of the infamous Delhi rape, did a piece called The Walk, which is it's online. You can see different versions of it online. Mayarao, The Walk, what you would Google. And she's asking questions about identity and safety of women and, how are women treated and who are we and what is our relationship to society, to government, to each other, etc. So I think there's a very interesting and complicated set of questions being raised in the theater now.
We'll post links, images, and video that will allow you to explore the world of modern Indian theater in more detail. Erin, thank you so much for a great conversation.
Michael, thank you so much for devoting 2 episodes of this podcast to Indian theater.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter and Facebook. You can also visit our website at theaterhistorypodcast.net, where you can find links to all of our episodes. And you can email your questions and comments about the show to theaterhistory@theaterhistorypodcast.net. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our music this week comes to us courtesy of Kavalam Narayana Panikar. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.